The outdoor wedding reception glowed under string lights draped between towering oak trees. The late afternoon sun cast golden shadows across manicured lawns. Crystal glasses caught the light as guests in designer attire mingled on the terrace, their laughter mixing with the gentle melody of a string quartet. Near a marble column, barely visible among the sea of celebration, sat a 10-year-old girl in an ivory silk dress, her wheelchair positioned where she could see but not be seen. Sophie Morgan's small hands rested motionless on the armrests, her eyes following the dancers with the quiet longing of someone accustomed to watching life from the sidelines. Nobody noticed her watching the dance floor where her mother smiled and chatted with the city's elite. Nobody except Michael Reynolds. He stood at the edge of the reception, a man whose calloused hands and worn dress shirt marked him as someone who built the world others inhabited. His weathered face creased with a frown as his eyes fell on the solitary child. "Why is she alone?" he murmured, more to himself than to his 8-year-old daughter Emily, who stood beside him in her carefully pressed second-hand dress, her hair braided with the kind of patience that came from being someone's entire world. The contrast between their worlds had never been sharper than in this moment. Michael carried the weight of 38 years in his work-hardened hands and the lines around his eyes, each mark earned through late nights fixing electrical systems in office buildings across the city. Emily sat beside him at a corner table, her second-hand party dress carefully pressed, her hair braided with the kind of patience that came from being someone's entire world. They were here because of an old friendship, a college roommate who'd climbed different ladders, but Michael felt the familiar sting of not quite belonging. He watched Emily's eyes widen at the elaborate ice sculpture, at the servers carrying silver trays, at a world she glimpsed but would never inherit. This was the life he couldn't give her, and the knowledge sat heavy in his chest like stones. Across the reception, Alexandra Morgan moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to command rooms before she'd learned to command her own heart. At 35, she was everything the business magazine said: brilliant, beautiful, ruthless when necessary. Morgan Enterprises' quarterly reports spoke of her success in numbers that most people couldn't fathom. But numbers had never explained why she stood alone, even in crowds like this. Her daughter Sophie had been the center of her universe once, before the accident 4 years ago left them both changed in ways that medical reports couldn't capture. Now Sophie sat in her wheelchair, receiving the best care money could buy, but missing something that no amount of wealth could purchase. Alexandra told herself she was protecting her daughter from disappointment, from the world's cruelty, from hope that might be crushed again. But protection, she was learning, could look remarkably like abandonment. The two parents lived their separate struggles in the same city, their children growing up in parallel universes of want and wealth. Michael's apartment was small, but filled with evidence of presence: crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, a reading corner with mismatched pillows, a jar of coins they saved together for Emily's college fund. He bandaged scraped knees with cartoon bandages, read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, and folded origami cranes from newspaper when Emily needed to make wishes on fallen eyelashes. His love was measured in time given freely, in attention paid without distraction, in the way he listened when she talked about playground politics with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Alexandra's penthouse was a monument to everything Sophie might need: physical therapists, private tutors, the latest adaptive technology, a full-time nurse who managed every aspect of her daughter's care with professional efficiency. She provided everything except the one thing she'd forgotten how to give: herself. Since the accident, Alexandra had poured her energy into creating a fortress of security around Sophie, hiring experts to handle what she no longer trusted herself to manage. She attended meetings about Sophie's progress, signed checks for equipment, and made decisions about her daughter's life from boardrooms and cars. But she hadn't sat on the floor to play a game, hadn't read a bedtime story, hadn't simply asked about Sophie's dreams in so long that she'd forgotten what her daughter's natural laugh sounded like. The moment Michael noticed Sophie was the moment everything shifted, though none of them understood it yet. He saw what everyone else had learned to look past: a child sitting alone while adults celebrated love and family around her. He saw the careful way she held her hands folded in her lap, the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned not to draw attention to her needs. When he approached, Sophie looked up with the startled expression of someone unaccustomed to being seen. Her face had the pale quality of too much time spent indoors, but her eyes held the bright intelligence that no accident could dim. She was beautiful in the way that children are beautiful when they're trying very hard to be invisible. And Michael's heart broke a little for all the ways the world had taught her to shrink. "Hi there," he said, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm Michael. That's my daughter Emily over there, the one with the braids." Sophie followed his gaze to where Emily was carefully folding her napkin into what might become a flower. "She's shy too, but she makes friends with origami. Would you like to meet her?" Sophie nodded, and for the first time all evening, someone asked what she wanted instead of what she needed. When Michael wheeled her chair toward their table, positioning her where she could see everything, Sophie smiled with the rusty quality of something that hadn't been used in too long. Emily looked up from her paper flower and immediately began teaching Sophie the folds, their heads bent together over the makeshift craft project, two children finding each other across the vast divide of their different worlds. The scene might have been perfect in its simplicity, but perfection rarely survives contact with reality. A cluster of wedding guests noticed the unusual tableau: the working-class electrician, his modestly dressed daughter, and the CEO's disabled child sharing what looked dangerously like joy. Their whispers carried the sharp edge of social boundaries being crossed, of protocols being violated. A woman in pearls and practiced disapproval approached, her smile tight with the kind of concern that felt more like control. "Excuse me," she said to Michael, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "but this really isn't appropriate. That's Miss Morgan's daughter, and she has specific care requirements. I don't think you understand the situation." Her words were polite, but her meaning was clear. "People like you don't belong here, especially not with children like her." Michael felt the familiar burn of being dismissed, of having his worth measured by his bank account or his zip code. But Sophie was watching, and Emily was listening. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not for ourselves, but for the children who need to see that kindness doesn't require permission. "I understand that she's a little girl who was sitting alone at a party," he replied quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I understand that she smiled when someone paid attention to her. And I understand that treating children like they're fragile is different from treating them like they're invisible." The woman's face flushed, and other guests began to turn, drawn by the tension and voices that were trying to remain civil. Sophie had gone very still, the way children do when adults fight about them instead of with them. And Michael realized that his defense of her was about to become another burden she'd have to carry. That's when Alexandra appeared, drawn by the commotion and the sight of her daughter surrounded by strangers. She moved through the crowd with the swift efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, her heels clicking against the stone terrace like a countdown. When she saw Sophie at the table with Michael and Emily, saw the paper flowers scattered between them, saw her daughter's face bright with something that looked dangerously like happiness, Alexandra felt a complex mix of relief and panic. Relief that Sophie was safe, engaged, smiling. Panic that a stranger had accomplished in minutes what she hadn't managed in months. But panic won, the way it always did when she felt her control slipping. And she reverted to the persona that had carried her through boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the polite ice that could freeze conversations across conference tables. "But I need to take Sophie now. She has a schedule, and this wasn't part of it." She moved to position herself behind Sophie's wheelchair, her hands gripping the handles with more force than necessary. Michael stood slowly, and Alexandra found herself looking up at him, taking in the worn edges of his clothes, the faint traces of electrical tape stuck to his sleeve, the way he held himself like someone who'd learned not to expect much from people like her. She made a calculation based on appearance, on assumptions that felt safer than curiosity, and delivered the words that would haunt her for months. "My daughter doesn't need your pity, and she doesn't need an electrician lecturing me about parenting." The silence that followed was the kind that draws blood. Emily's face crumpled with the particular devastation of children who've watched their parent be publicly humiliated. Sophie's smile died so completely it was like watching a light switch be turned off. Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond with anger. Instead, he crouched down one more time, looked directly at Sophie, and said, "It was really nice meeting you. Thank you for teaching me about paper flowers." Then he took Emily's hand and walked away, leaving Alexandra standing with her daughter in a circle of watching eyes and heavy silence. But Sophie was watching Michael leave with an expression that Alexandra had never seen before. The look of someone who'd been given a gift and then watched it be taken away. It was the look of a child who'd remembered what it felt like to be just a child. Not a medical case or a source of worry or a symbol of tragedy, but simply a person worth talking to. And Alexandra, for all her success in reading people and situations, couldn't decode the devastation in her daughter's eyes, or understand why her own chest felt tight with something that might have been shame. The days that followed the wedding were marked by a silence that felt different from their usual quiet. Sophie, who had grown accustomed to the routines of physical therapy and tutoring sessions, now moved through her schedule with a listlessness that worried her medical team. She ate less, spoke even less, and spent hours staring out her bedroom window at the city beyond. When her nurse asked what was wrong, Sophie simply shook her head. When her tutor tried to engage her in lessons, she participated with mechanical precision, but no enthusiasm. It was as if something vital had been awakened at the wedding and then immediately extinguished, leaving her more aware of what was missing. Alexandra threw herself into work with renewed intensity, as if quarterly reports and acquisition deals could somehow balance the equation she couldn't solve at home. But concentration proved elusive when she kept remembering the sound of Sophie's laugh, brief as it had been, genuine in a way she hadn't heard since before the accident. She found herself checking the security footage from the wedding, watching the moments when Sophie's face had come alive while folding paper with Emily, seeing her daughter become animated in a way that no amount of expensive therapy had achieved. The footage was damning in its simplicity. It showed a child who'd been starving for ordinary human connection and a mother who'd been too afraid to provide it. Late one night, unable to sleep, Alexandra stood outside Sophie's bedroom door and heard her daughter talking quietly to her night nurse. "He saw me," Sophie was saying, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Not my wheelchair, not my problems, just me. And he asked what I wanted, not what I needed." The nurse made sympathetic sounds, but Sophie continued, "Mom never asks what I want anymore. She just makes sure I have everything I'm supposed to have. But I don't know what I want because nobody ever asks." Alexandra pressed her back against the hallway wall, her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The truth of her daughter's words hit her like a physical blow. She had become so focused on managing Sophie's disability that she'd forgotten to nurture Sophie's humanity. The realization that followed was both devastating and clarifying. Alexandra had spent 4 years building walls between herself and her daughter's pain, believing that professional distance would somehow protect them both. She'd hired others to provide comfort because she was terrified of failing, of saying the wrong thing, of not being enough. But in her effort to shield Sophie from disappointment, she'd withheld the one thing no expert could provide: a mother's imperfect, unconditional presence. She'd been running a corporation's worth of people to care for one small girl, when what Sophie needed was for her mother to simply show up, sit down, and stay. That night, Alexandra made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would find Michael Reynolds, not to defend her actions or explain her circumstances, but to understand what he'd seen in Sophie that she'd been missing. She would swallow her pride, admit her failures, and ask for help, not as a CEO accustomed to purchasing solutions, but as a mother who'd lost her way. It would mean acknowledging that love wasn't always about providing the best of everything, but sometimes about being willing to provide the most important thing: yourself, flawed and frightened and present. The next morning dawned gray and uncertain, matching the weather in Alexandra's chest as she drove through parts of the city she'd only seen from highway overpasses. The GPS led her through neighborhoods where houses sat close together, where children's bicycles leaned against chain-link fences, where laundry hung on lines instead of disappearing into machines operated by housekeeping staff. She felt like an alien in her luxury sedan, conscious of how her clothes, her car, her entire presentation marked her as an outsider. But she kept driving because turning back would mean accepting that the gulf between their worlds was unbridgeable, and Sophie's future happiness might depend on proving that assumption wrong. Michael's building was a 3-story brick structure with flower boxes and some windows and a playground across the street where children played while their parents watched from benches. Alexandra sat in her car for several minutes, rehearsing what she might say, before realizing that this wasn't a business meeting that could be scripted and controlled. She was about to ask a stranger to help her learn how to be a mother to her own child, and no amount of preparation could make that conversation easy. When she finally knocked on apartment 2B, she heard footsteps, and then Michael opened the door with the expression of someone who'd been expecting anyone but her. "Miss Morgan," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Behind him, she could see a small apartment that looked lived in rather than decorated, comfortable rather than impressive. Alexandra had prepared several opening lines, professional approaches to what felt like a negotiation, but what came out was simpler and more honest than anything she'd planned. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to start over." Michael studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him step aside and gesture toward their small kitchen table. As Alexandra sat down, she noticed details that spoke of a life lived with attention. Drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on a side table, books with cracked spines that had clearly been read multiple times. This was what a home looked like when someone was actually living in it rather than just maintaining it. "Sophie hasn't spoken since the wedding," Alexandra began, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly around the coffee mug Michael had offered. "I mean, she answers questions, follows instructions, participates in her therapies, but she's not really there anymore. And I realize that I don't know how to reach her because I've been so busy protecting her that I forgot how to connect with her." She looked up at Michael, her composure cracking slightly. "I don't know what you did in those few minutes, but you reminded her of something I made her forget, and I need to understand what that was." Michael sat across from her, and his response surprised her with its gentleness rather than accusation. "I didn't do anything special. I just treated her like a person instead of a condition. I asked what she wanted instead of what she needed. I assumed she had opinions and preferences and the right to make choices about small things like whether she wanted to learn origami." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sophie isn't fragile because she uses a wheelchair. She's lonely because she's been isolated from ordinary experiences in the name of keeping her safe." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and changed both of their lives. Alexandra found herself telling Michael about the accident, about the guilt that had driven her to hire teams of experts rather than trust her own instincts, about the fear that she wasn't enough to help her daughter heal. Michael shared his own struggles with single parenthood, with the weight of being someone's entire world, with the daily balance between protection and independence that every parent had to navigate. They discovered that despite their different circumstances, they were both wrestling with the same fundamental question: how do you love someone enough to let them risk being hurt? When Alexandra finally asked if he and Emily would consider visiting Sophie, it wasn't as CEO of Morgan Enterprises making a business proposition. It was as a mother admitting she needed help learning how to be present in her own daughter's life. Michael's yes was equally simple, offered not because he was impressed by her wealth or status, but because he'd seen Sophie's face at the wedding and understood that some children's happiness was worth crossing social boundaries to protect. The Saturday visits that followed became an experiment in creating connections across divides that had seemed insurmountable. Alexandra's penthouse, usually sterile in its perfection, gradually showed signs of actual living. Sophie began speaking more, asking questions, expressing preferences about food and activities, and how she wanted to spend her time. She taught Emily about the adaptive technologies she used, while Emily taught Sophie card games and showed her how to braid friendship bracelets. The two girls created elaborate imaginary worlds during their play, stories where differences were adventures rather than limitations. The adults learned to navigate their own growing connection with careful attention to their daughter's needs. Alexandra discovered that she enjoyed cooking when it meant creating something together, rather than simply providing nutrition. She and Emily spent one memorable afternoon attempting to bake cookies, resulting in a kitchen disaster that left them both covered in flour and laughing helplessly. Michael found himself becoming Sophie's unofficial consultant on accessibility improvements around the penthouse, small modifications that increased her independence while teaching Alexandra to see her environment through her daughter's eyes. More importantly, Alexandra began learning how to be present without an agenda. She sat with Sophie during afternoon rest periods, not to monitor her condition, but simply to be available if conversation arose. She discovered that her daughter had opinions about books, preferences about music, and dreams about travel that had nothing to do with medical considerations. Sophie wanted to see the ocean, learn to paint watercolors, and maybe get a dog someday. These were ordinary childhood desires that had been buried under layers of therapeutic objectives and safety protocols. One evening, as the four of them sat in Alexandra's living room, Sophie looked at Michael with curious eyes. "Were you in the army? I saw a picture in your apartment with you in a uniform." Michael nodded, a shadow crossing his face. 8 years. Army Corps of Engineers. "That's how you learned about electricity?" Sophie pressed. "Part of it. My dad was an electrician too. He taught me the basics when I was about your age." Alexandra watched this exchange with interest. There was so much about Michael she still didn't know. Layers to him that his worn work clothes and direct manner didn't reveal. "Is that where you got that scar?" Sophie pointed to a thin white line that ran along Michael's forearm. "Sophie," Alexandra admonished gently, "that's a personal question." Michael smiled. "It's okay. No, this wasn't from the army. This was from my first job after. I was in a hurry, didn't respect the power I was working with. Electricity doesn't forgive carelessness." He rolled up his sleeve to show the scar more clearly. "That's why I'm always telling Emily to be careful. Some lessons leave marks." His words hung in the air, carrying meaning beyond the physical scar. Alexandra felt them resonate with her own experience. The accident that had marked both her and Sophie. The lessons she was still learning about what truly mattered. "Did it hurt?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. "Like fire," Michael answered honestly. "But pain teaches us things too. Makes us stronger, smarter. Makes us appreciate the good days more." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, processing this adult wisdom with the seriousness children sometimes bring to big ideas. "That's like me after my accident. Everything hurt for a long time, but I'm stronger now." The simple truth of her statement caught Alexandra off guard. Her daughter had been processing her trauma all this time, forming her own understanding of what had happened to her, while Alexandra had been too busy managing Sophie's care to hear her perspective. "You are strong," Alexandra said, her voice thick with emotion. "Stronger than I've given you credit for." Sophie's eyes widened at this acknowledgement. Then she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "Can we go to the park tomorrow? The one with the adaptive swings?" "Yes," Alexandra answered without hesitation, without checking schedules or consulting therapists. Just a mother saying yes to her daughter's simple request. "We can absolutely go to the park tomorrow." Later, after Sophie had gone to bed and Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, Alexandra and Michael stood on the penthouse balcony, the city lights spread before them like stars brought down to earth. "Thank you," Alexandra said, the words inadequate for the gratitude she felt, "for helping me see her again." Michael leaned against the railing, his strong hands, the hands that worked with dangerous currents every day, gentle as they cradled a cup of coffee. "She was never lost, just waiting for you to find her." The comfortable silence that followed was broken by Michael's phone buzzing. He checked it and frowned. "Everything okay?" Alexandra asked. "Just work. A client rescheduled tomorrow, which means I'll have to move some things around." His face showed the constant calculations of a single parent juggling responsibilities, a familiar expression Alexandra was beginning to recognize from her own mirror. "I could help," she offered impulsively. "With Emily, I mean, if you ever need someone to watch her while you work." Michael's eyebrow raised in surprise. "The CEO of Morgan Enterprises offering babysitting services?" "No," Alexandra corrected with a small smile. "Sophie's mom offering to help Emily's dad. That's different." Michael looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and Alexandra felt seen in a way she hadn't in years, not as a CEO or an heiress or even as Sophie's mother, but simply as herself. "That might be nice," he finally said. "Emily likes you, and Sophie adores her." The simplicity of his acceptance touched something in Alexandra, a part of her that had been dormant since before the accident, perhaps even longer. A part that remembered what it was like to connect with someone without agendas or expectations, to be valued for something other than what she could provide. The moment was interrupted by the elevator doors opening, and James Whitfield, Alexandra's CFO and occasional dinner companion, stepped into the penthouse unannounced. "Alex, we need to discuss the Thompson merger before tomorrow's call. I've been trying to reach you all evening and—" He stopped short, taking in the scene. Emily asleep on the couch, Michael standing close to Alexandra on the balcony, the casual intimacy of their conversation. "I didn't realize you had company," James said, disapproval evident in his tone. Alexandra straightened, CEO mode activating automatically. "James, this is Michael Reynolds." "Michael, James Whitfield, my CFO." The two men sized each other up, a current of tension immediately apparent. "Reynolds," James repeated, his brow furrowing. "Why does that name sound familiar?" Michael's posture shifted subtly, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for impact. "Maybe because you signed the paperwork firing me 3 years ago." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly, charged with a voltage as dangerous as any live wire Michael had ever handled. "You worked for Morgan Enterprises?" Alexandra asked, confusion evident in her voice. Michael's laugh was short and bitter. "For 7 years, senior electrical engineer in the development division, until the restructuring that conveniently happened right after I filed safety reports about the wiring issues in the new headquarters." James's expression hardened. "Those claims were investigated and dismissed as unfounded." "They were buried," Michael corrected, his voice low but intense. "And 3 months later, there was an electrical malfunction in the executive parking garage. The same garage where—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes darting to the living room where Sophie's wheelchair sat empty next to the couch. Alexandra's face had gone pale, her mind racing to connect dots she'd never thought to align before. "The same garage where Sophie's accident occurred," she finished, her voice barely audible. The truth hung in the air between them, a connection none of them had realized until this moment. Michael had tried to prevent the very accident that had changed Sophie's life forever. James stepped forward, his voice sharp with warning. "Alex, I don't know what he's told you, but this man has clearly engineered this situation to gain access to you. He was terminated for cause, and now he's using your daughter to what? Get revenge? Extract a settlement?" Michael's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching at his sides. "I didn't know who Sophie was until the wedding. I had no idea Alexandra Morgan's daughter was the child injured in that accident." "A convenient coincidence," James sneered. "Enough." Alexandra's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "James, I think you should leave." "Alex, you can't seriously be considering—" "I said leave." Her tone left no room for argument. "We'll discuss the Thompson merger tomorrow." After James departed, the penthouse fell into uneasy silence. Michael moved to wake Emily, his movements controlled but radiating tension. "We should go too," he said quietly. "No." Alexandra's voice was firm. "Not until we talk about this." Michael hesitated, years of resentment warring with the connection they'd been building over the past few weeks. "What's there to talk about? I tried to warn your company about faulty wiring. I was fired for my trouble, and Sophie paid the price for corporate corner cutting." "I never saw those reports," Alexandra said, her voice hollow. "They never crossed my desk." Would it have mattered if they had? The question hung between them, sharp as broken glass. Alexandra thought of the woman she'd been before the accident, driven, focused on the company's bottom line, trusting her executives to handle day-to-day operations while she concentrated on strategy and growth. Would she have paid attention to safety reports from an electrical engineer? Would she have recognized the potential consequences of ignoring them? "I don't know," she admitted, the truth painful but necessary. "I'd like to think yes, but I don't know." Michael nodded, appreciating her honesty even through his anger. "For what it's worth, I've always wondered if I could have done more, gone public, risked everything. Maybe if I had, Sophie would still be—" "Don't." Alexandra cut him off, unable to bear the weight of hypotheticals. "We can't change what happened. We can only decide what happens now." They stood facing each other across the living room, two people connected by tragedy and chance in their children's friendship, trying to navigate a past neither had fully processed and a future neither had anticipated. "What do you want to happen now?" Michael asked finally. Alexandra looked at Emily sleeping peacefully on the couch, at Sophie's empty wheelchair, at the paper flowers they'd made together scattered across the coffee table, evidence of joy reclaimed from the wreckage of the past. "I want to understand what really happened," she said firmly. "All of it. The reports you filed, why they were buried, who made those decisions. And I want the people responsible to be held accountable. Even if those people include your CFO, your board, yourself." "Especially then." Alexandra's eyes were steady, unblinking. "Sophie deserves that much. All the children who could be hurt by similar negligence deserve that much." Michael studied her face, looking for signs of the corporate executive he'd once resented, the woman who'd dismissed him at the wedding. Instead, he saw something new, a mother finding her strength, a leader recognizing her responsibility. "That won't be easy," he warned. "People like James don't surrender power without a fight." "I'm counting on that." A hint of the CEO's steel returned to Alexandra's voice. "Because I've never backed down from a fight worth winning." For the first time since James had spoken his name, Michael smiled. A small tentative thing, but genuine. "Neither have I." The sound of a door opening drew their attention. Sophie stood in the hallway in her pajamas, her wheelchair abandoned as she leaned on the specialized crutches she used for short distances. "Mom, is everything okay? I heard voices." Alexandra crossed to her daughter, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Michael and I were just talking about some grown-up things." Sophie looked between them, her young face showing the perceptiveness that children often surprise adults with. "Are you fighting? Because you look like you were fighting." Michael moved to stand beside Alexandra, both adults now at Sophie's eye level. "Not fighting," he clarified. "Sometimes adults discover difficult truths, and it takes them a minute to figure out what to do about them." "What kind of truths?" Sophie pressed. Alexandra and Michael exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them about how much to share. "The kind that might help us understand your accident better," Alexandra said finally. "Michael used to work for Mommy's company, and he noticed some problems that might have contributed to what happened to you." Sophie's eyes widened. "So it wasn't just bad luck?" "No, sweetheart. It might not have been just bad luck." Sophie absorbed this, her brow furrowing in concentration. Then she looked at Michael, her expression serious. "Does that mean you could have stopped it?" The question, direct and unsparing in the way only children can be, hit Michael like a physical blow. His face paled, and Alexandra could see his pulse jumping in his throat. "I tried," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I tried, but no one listened." Sophie nodded, processing this with remarkable composure. Then she did something that surprised both adults. She stepped forward on her crutches and wrapped one arm around Michael in a half-hug. "It's okay," she said. "It wasn't your fault. And look, now we're friends because of it." The simple forgiveness, the childlike ability to find good in tragedy, broke something open in both adults. Michael's eyes welled with tears. He quickly blinked away. Alexandra felt her own throat tighten with emotion. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Now we're friends because of it." As she helped Sophie back to bed, Alexandra thought about the strange paths that had led them all to this moment. A chance meeting at a wedding, a shared past none of them had recognized, a future they were only beginning to imagine. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, corporate investigations, perhaps even legal battles. But tonight something new had begun to take root in the space between their separate worlds. Understanding, forgiveness, and the possibility that healing might come in forms none of them had expected. When she returned to the living room, Michael was gently waking Emily, who blinked sleepily up at her father. "Time to go home, kiddo," he said softly. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Emily asked, rubbing her eyes. Michael looked at Alexandra, the question in his eyes matching his daughter's spoken one. "Yes," Alexandra said firmly. "Tomorrow we're all going to the park. Sophie's very excited about it." As she walked them to the elevator, Michael paused at the threshold. "This doesn't change things overnight, you know. What happened it's complicated." "I know," Alexandra acknowledged, "but I think maybe complicated is what we do best." Michael nodded, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I'll bring my tool bag tomorrow. Those adaptive swings sometimes need adjusting." It was such a practical Michael thing to say, offering to fix something broken, to make something work better. that Alexandra found herself smiling in return. "We'll see you tomorrow then." As the elevator doors closed between them, Alexandra knew they were standing at the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, a connection forged in shared pain, but looking toward shared healing. A reluctant alliance that felt suddenly like exactly where they were meant to be. The morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Alexandra stood by the penthouse windows, watching sunlight glint off neighboring buildings, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. Sleep had eluded her after Michael and Emily's departure, her mind racing with implications of what she'd learned. Sophie's accident, the moment that had divided her life into before and after, might not have been an accident at all, but the result of corporate negligence, her own company's negligence, possibly enabled by her own inattention. The thought made her stomach clench with a fresh wave of guilt and anger. "Mom?" Sophie's voice pulled her from dark thoughts. Her daughter wheeled herself into the living room, already dressed for their promised park outing, excitement visible in every line of her body. "Are we still going? You didn't change your mind, did you?" Alexandra set down her coffee and knelt beside Sophie's wheelchair. "Of course we're still going. I promised, didn't I?" Sophie's expression held cautious hope. Sometimes your promises get rescheduled. The simple observation landed like a slap. How many times had Alexandra postponed outings due to work emergencies? How many "I'll be there soon" texts had turned into missed dinners and bedtimes? "Not today." Hey," Alexandra said firmly. "Today is just for us, and for Michael and Emily when they join us." Sophie's face brightened. "Emily said she'd teach me how to make a paper swan. It's harder than the crane." Alexandra brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, noticing how Sophie's eyes, so like her own, sparkled with anticipation. "You really like them, don't you, Michael and Emily?" "Emily makes me laugh," Sophie said simply, "and Michael doesn't look at me like I'm broken." The honesty cut deep. Alexandra had spent 4 years trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, focusing so intently on Sophie's paralysis that she'd missed seeing Sophie herself. "You're not broken," Alexandra whispered, her voice catching. "You're perfect exactly as you are." Sophie tilted her head, studying her mother with the piercing insight of children. "Then why do you look so sad when you look at me?" Alexandra's breath caught. How to explain to a 10-year-old the complex tangle of guilt and grief and fear that had shaped their relationship since the accident? "Because I've been afraid," she admitted finally. "Afraid of failing you, afraid of not being enough. And I let that fear keep me from simply being your mom." Sophie considered this, her young face solemn. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm still me." "Yes," Alexandra agreed, tears threatening. "You are absolutely still you. And I'm going to do better at seeing that." The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the private elevator from the lobby. Sophie's face lit up. "They're here!" Alexandra straightened, quickly composing herself as the elevator doors opened. Emily bounded out, carrying a small backpack and wearing a practical outfit for a day at the park. Michael followed more slowly, his ever-present tool bag in one hand and a grocery sack in the other. Unlike his daughter's excitement, his expression was guarded, the revelations of the previous night clearly still weighing on him. "We brought sandwiches," Emily announced, rushing to Sophie. "Dad made them this morning, and cookies too." "Thank you," Alexandra said, accepting the grocery sack from Michael. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt the calluses on his hand, physical evidence of a life spent building and fixing things that her smooth, manicured hands had never known. "Least we could do," Michael replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Beautiful day for the park." "The best day," Sophie agreed enthusiastically. "Mom says we can stay as long as we want." Michael's eyebrow raised slightly at this departure from Alexandra's usually regimented scheduling, but he merely nodded. "Then we better get going. Those swings won't swing themselves." As they made their way to the elevator, Alexandra's phone rang. James Whitfield's name flashed on the screen. She silenced it without answering. "Work?" Michael asked, noticing the gesture. "Nothing that can't wait," Alexandra replied firmly. Sophie's surprised smile was worth every email that would pile up in her absence. The community park was alive with weekend activity, families picnicking, children racing across playgrounds, dogs chasing frisbees across open fields. Alexandra pushed Sophie's wheelchair along the paved paths, hyper-aware of obstacles and uneven surfaces she'd never noticed before. Michael walked beside them, occasionally pointing out aspects of the park's accessibility design, both good and bad. "See how they graded this section?" he noted, gesturing to a gently sloping path. "Smart engineering, but they should have extended the handrails another 10 feet. His knowledge surprised Alexandra. "You know a lot about accessibility design for an electrician?" "Corps of engineers," Michael replied simply. "Plus I did the electrical work on 380 renovation projects last year. You learn to see spaces differently." They reached the adaptive playground area where specialized equipment allowed children of varying abilities to play together. Sophie's eyes fixed on the adaptive swing, a molded seat with supportive sides and secure harnesses. "Can I?" she asked eagerly. "Of course," Alexandra began, helping Sophie transfer from her wheelchair. But her movements were uncertain, overly cautious. "May I?" Michael stepped forward, hands hovering but not touching. "I've done this before." Alexandra hesitated, then nodded. Michael moved with quiet confidence, showing Sophie the most efficient way to shift her weight, supporting her with strong hands that knew exactly where to provide stability without taking away independence. "You've got it," he encouraged as Sophie settled into the swing. Just like that. Soon Sophie was swinging gently, her face alight with simple joy. Emily joined her in an adjacent traditional swing, both girls pumping higher as Michael gave occasional pushes. Alexandra watched from a nearby bench, struck by the ease with which Michael navigated Sophie's needs, not minimizing her disability, but not defining her by it either. He treated each adaptive movement as a normal part of life, without the anxious hovering that Alexandra realized had characterized her own approach. "She's having fun," a voice observed, and Alexandra turned to find an older woman seated beside her. "Your daughter?" "Yes," Alexandra replied, warmed by the simple interaction, so different from the carefully orchestrated business conversations that filled her days. "And your husband seems wonderful with her." Alexandra started to correct the assumption, but stopped herself. What was Michael to her? Not her husband, certainly, but in the span of a few weeks, he'd become something more significant than a stranger, more complex than a friend. "He is," she said finally. "He sees her differently than I do." The woman nodded sagely. "My husband was like that with our son. I worried about everything, every bump, every bruise. He taught our boy to climb trees even after the doctor said his heart condition should keep him grounded." She smiled at a distant memory. "Sometimes love looks like protection. Sometimes it looks like letting go." Alexandra considered these words as she watched Michael adjust the swing's harness, his hands certain and gentle. "I'm still learning which is which," she admitted. "Aren't we all, dear?" The woman patted her hand and moved on, leaving Alexandra with the uncomfortable realization that she'd spent 4 years mistaking control for care. The morning passed in a blur of activity. The girls moved from swings to an accessible merry-go-round, then to a sand table raised to wheelchair height where they built elaborate castles. Michael produced tools from his bag to tighten loose bolts on playground equipment, automatically fixing small problems as he noticed them. They spread a blanket for lunch, Michael's homemade sandwiches simple but delicious. Alexandra watched Emily carefully cut Sophie's sandwich into manageable pieces without being asked, with the matter-of-fact helpfulness of a child who didn't see assistance as unusual. "These are really good," Alexandra commented, surprised by the quality of the humble meal. "Just sandwiches," Michael shrugged, but she caught the slight smile of pride. "When you're a single dad, you either learn to cook or go broke on takeout." "I never learned," Alexandra admitted. "Even before the accident, we had a personal chef. I can barely manage toast." "Hence the kitchen disaster with the cookies," Michael teased, and Alexandra was startled into laughter. "That was entirely Emily's fault," she protested. "She said the recipe needed more of everything." "Hey," Emily objected through a mouthful of cookie. "It would have worked if you hadn't turned the mixer to high." Sophie giggled, the sound so natural and unguarded that Alexandra felt her chest tighten. When was the last time she'd heard her daughter laugh like that? When was the last time she'd made her daughter laugh like that? Masao. As lunch concluded, Michael's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowning slightly. "Work emergency. Electrical panel at the Westside Medical Building is acting up." I should go check it out. Alexandra felt a stab of disappointment, then surprise at her own reaction. Of course, she said quickly. We understand. I don't want to go, Emily protested, looking from her father to Sophie with dismay. Michael knelt beside his daughter. I know, kiddo, but remember our talk about responsibilities. Emily's shoulders slumped. That sometimes we have to do things we don't want to because people are counting on us. Exactly. And right now, a whole medical building full of doctors and patients is counting on me to fix their power. He glanced at Alexandra. I hate to cut this short. Emily could stay with us, Alexandra offered impulsively. If that's okay with you, we were planning to visit the botanical gardens after this. She'd be welcome to join us. Michael hesitated, clearly weighing his daughter's safety against his professional obligations. You're sure it's not an imposition? Positive. Alexandra met his eyes steadily. We'd enjoy the company. Michael looked at Emily's hopeful face, then back to Alexandra. All right, but I'll meet you at the gardens as soon as I'm done. 2 hours tops. He knelt to hug Emily, murmuring something in her ear that made her giggle, then shook Sophie's hand solemnly. Thank you for letting Emily stay. Keep an eye on her for me. Sophie nodded, accepting the responsibility with pride. We'll be careful. As Michael packed up his tool bag, Alexandra walked a few steps away with him. Thank you for today, she said quietly, for showing me how to be with her again. Michael's expression softened. You always knew how. You just forgot for a while. He shouldered his bag, then added, about last night. We'll talk later, Alexandra promised, when the girls aren't waiting. He nodded, relief briefly crossing his face. Later then. Alexandra watched him walk away, struck by the contradictions he embodied. A skilled tradesman who'd once been an engineer, a stern father who folded paper flowers, a man who'd lost his job for doing the right thing and somehow avoided becoming bitter. Mom, Sophie called, can we go see the flowers now? Alexandra turned back to the girls, pushing thoughts of corporate investigations and potential scandals aside. Absolutely. Let's go see some flowers. The botanical gardens were a riot of spring color, manicured paths winding between carefully tended beds of tulips, daffodils, and hyacinths. Alexandra pushed Sophie's wheelchair while Emily walked alongside, the girls chattering about which flowers they liked best. Look at those. Emily pointed to a stunning display of blue delphiniums. They're the same color as my school uniform. I like the yellow ones, Sophie decided, indicating bright ranunculus blooms. They look happy. Alexandra absorbed their simple joy, recognizing how rarely she'd taken time to notice such things herself. Her life had become a blur of boardrooms and balance sheets, strategy meetings and shareholder reports. When had she last stopped to really look at flowers? As they rounded a corner toward the rose garden, Alexandra froze. James Whitfield stood near the central fountain, deep in conversation with 2 board members of Morgan Enterprises. This was no coincidence. The botanical garden was a known weekend retreat for the city's business elite, and James was clearly conducting informal business outside the office. Mom? Sophie questioned her sudden stillness. What's wrong? Nothing, sweetheart. Alexandra forced a smile, quickly turning the wheelchair down a side path. I just remembered something. Let's go see the butterfly house instead. But it was too late. James had spotted her and was already approaching, his business smile firmly in place. Alexandra, what a pleasant surprise. His gaze swept over Sophie, Emily, and the conspicuous absence of Michael. Enjoying a little family time? Yes, Alexandra replied coolly. Sophie loves the gardens. James crouched to Sophie's level, a gesture that should have seemed friendly but felt patronizing. And how are you today, young lady? Feeling well? Sophie nodded without enthusiasm, her previous animation fading in James's presence. And who's this? James turned to Emily, his smile never reaching his eyes. I'm Emily Reynolds, she answered, instinctively moving closer to Sophie's wheelchair. My dad had to fix emergency at the hospital. Reynolds, James straightened, his expression hardening. I see. Alexandra, might I have a word in private? Actually, we were just heading to the butterfly house, Alexandra began, but James interrupted. It's about the Thompson merger. Very time-sensitive. His tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. Alexandra hesitated, then knelt beside Sophie. Sweetie, I need to speak with Mr. Whitfield for just a minute. Will you and Emily be okay right here? You can look at the koi pond, and I'll be right over there where you can see me. Sophie's face fell slightly, but she nodded. We'll be fine. Alexandra stepped away with James, maintaining a position where she could keep the girls in sight. What are you doing? James demanded without preamble, his corporate pleasantness evaporating. Spending time with my daughter, Alexandra replied evenly. Is that a problem? With Reynolds' child in tow, after what we discussed last night? Alex, the man is clearly positioning himself for a lawsuit. He gets fired, just happens to befriend your daughter, and now conveniently reveals he predicted the accident. This has shakedown written all over it. Alexandra's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I checked his personnel file this morning. He was terminated for cause, insubordination, making unfounded accusations, creating a hostile work environment. Accusations about safety issues that were never properly investigated, Alexandra countered, her voice low but intense. Safety issues that may have directly contributed to my daughter's injury. James's expression shifted to one of calculated concern. Alex, I understand you're emotional about this. Sophie's accident was tragic, but allowing this electrician to manipulate you through guilt. Stop, Alexandra's voice cut like a blade. Michael didn't seek me out. I went to him. And I've seen enough evidence to believe his safety concerns were legitimate and deliberately buried. By whom? James challenged. You run the company. If something was buried, it happened under your watch. The words struck home with painful accuracy. Alexandra glanced toward the koi pond, where Sophie and Emily were counting orange and white fish, heads bent together in concentration. Yes, she acknowledged quietly, it did happen under my watch, which is why I intend to investigate exactly what happened, who knew about it, and who decided my daughter's safety was an acceptable sacrifice for quarterly profits. James's face paled slightly. You can't be serious. The legal implications alone. I've never been more serious. Alexandra met his gaze steadily. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. I expect full transparency about the safety reports Michael filed and all actions taken or not taken in response. This is a mistake, James warned, his voice dropping. Think about the company. Think about the shareholders. I'm thinking about my daughter. Alexandra's tone left no room for argument. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have butterflies to see. She turned away, but James caught her arm. There's something you should know about Reynolds. His voice had an edge of desperation now. His wife didn't just leave. She left because he became obsessed with the safety issues, with being right. He put his principles above his family, and it cost him his marriage. Ask yourself if that's the kind of man you want around your daughter. Alexandra pulled her arm free. The kind of man who stands by his principles even when it costs him everything? Yes, James, that's exactly the kind of man I want around my daughter. She walked back to Sophie and Emily, her heart pounding, but her resolve strengthened. The girls looked up as she approached. Everything okay, Mom? Sophie asked, her perceptive eyes noting Alexandra's tension. Everything's fine, Alexandra assured her, forcing a smile. Who's ready to see some butterflies? As they moved away, Alexandra felt James's eyes boring into her back and knew with certainty that she had just made a powerful enemy. The butterfly house was a glass-domed tropical paradise, humid and lush with exotic plants. Butterflies of every imaginable color floated around them, occasionally landing on visitors who remained still enough. One particularly bold monarch butterfly perched on Sophie's wheelchair handle, its orange wings slowly opening and closing. It likes you, Emily whispered, carefully moving closer for a better look. It likes staying still, Sophie corrected with a grin. Mom's always moving too fast for butterflies. Alexandra laughed, recognizing the truth in her daughter's teasing. Guilty as charged. I'm trying to slow down, though. Look, Emily pointed as another butterfly, this one an iridescent blue, landed on Sophie's shoulder. You're a butterfly magnet. Sophie sat perfectly still, her face a study in delighted concentration. Alexandra knelt beside the wheelchair, her phone ready to capture the moment, when a small movement caught her eye. Sophie's right foot, paralyzed since the accident, twitched slightly as the butterfly's wings brushed against her arm. Alexandra froze, her heart suddenly racing. Had she imagined it? The doctors had been clear. The spinal damage was permanent, irreversible. Yet she'd seen movement. Tiny, involuntary perhaps, but definitely movement. "Sophie," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice casual, "can you feel the butterfly on your shoulder?" Sophie looked confused. "No, why? Just curious." Alexandra kept her tone light, not wanting to create false hope. But her mind was already racing with possibilities. Had the doctors missed something? Could there be neural pathways they hadn't detected? Or was it simply an autonomic response, meaning nothing? She made a mental note to call Dr. Weiss first thing Monday morning. For now, she would keep the observation to herself. Sophie had experienced enough medical scrutiny and dashed hopes. They spent another hour exploring the gardens, Sophie pointing out her favorite flowers, Emily collecting fallen petals for a project she mysteriously wouldn't explain. Alexandra pushed the wheelchair with a new awareness, every bump and dip in the path making her wonder if Sophie felt more than they realized. As promised, Michael texted when he finished the emergency repair, and they arranged to meet at the garden's main entrance. They found him waiting by the visitor center, his tool bag at his feet, his face relaxed after a successful job. "Dad!" Emily ran to him, excitedly waving her collection of flower petals. "We saw butterflies!" And Sophie had two land on her at the same time. "Is that right?" Michael smiled at Sophie. "Sounds like you've got a gift." "It was pretty cool," Sophie admitted, her natural reserve giving way to genuine enthusiasm. One was blue and sparkly, like something from a fairy tale. Alexandra watched the interaction, struck again by how easily Michael engaged with Sophie, treating her neither as a tragedy nor as an inspiration, but simply as a child with her own experiences and perspectives. "How was the repair job?" Alexandra asked as they walked toward the parking area. "Standard circuit overload. They're running too many diagnostic machines on outdated wiring." Michael shrugged. "I've recommended an upgrade 6 times, but the building manager keeps patching instead of fixing." "Sounds familiar," Alexandra remarked dryly. Michael glanced at her, understanding the parallel she was drawing to Morgan Enterprises. Sometimes people don't want to hear about problems until something breaks catastrophically. And sometimes, Alexandra added quietly, they don't want to hear about them even then. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. The conversation about Morgan Enterprises, about safety reports and negligence and accountability, remained unfinished. But in that look was a promise they would finish it together. "Mom," Sophie's voice broke the moment, "can Michael and Emily come back to our place? Emily wants to show me how to make paper stars for my ceiling." Alexandra hesitated, aware of the complications that lay between her and Michael, the corporate storm she was about to unleash come Monday morning. But looking at the hopeful faces of both girls, she couldn't bring herself to end the day. If Michael doesn't have other plans, they're very welcome. Michael seemed to weigh the invitation, perhaps considering the same complications. "No other plans," he decided finally, "and I believe I promised to look at that sticky door in Sophie's bathroom." Emily cheered, and the four of them continued toward the parking lot, an unlikely group bound together by circumstances none could have predicted. As they reached Alexandra's car, her phone rang again. James for the third time that afternoon. Once again, she sent the call to voicemail. "Something important?" Michael asked, noting her expression. "Nothing that can't wait until Monday," Alexandra replied, helping Sophie transfer to the car seat. But as she closed the car door, she noticed a text message that had slipped through her Do Not Disturb settings from her executive assistant. "Urgent. Security breach at headquarters. Server room. Call immediately." Alexandra stared at the message, a chill running down her spine. The server room, where all company records were stored, including personnel files, safety reports, and accident investigations. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, reading her sudden tension. Alexandra looked up, making a split-second decision. "Actually, there's an emergency at the office. I need to make a call." She moved a few steps away, dialing her assistant while keeping her voice low. "What's happening?" she demanded without preamble. "Security detected unauthorized access to the archive servers," her assistant explained rapidly. "Someone's been pulling files from 3 years ago, specifically all documentation related to the headquarters construction project and subsequent incidents." Alexandra's blood ran cold. When did this start? That's the thing. It's been going on for weeks. Small extractions, nothing that triggered alerts. But today they got sloppy, pulled too much at once. Do we know who? The digital trail leads to James Whitfield's access credentials, but he's claiming his account was hacked. Alexandra's gaze drifted to Michael, who was helping Emily into his truck while keeping a concerned eye on her. Could he be involved? Had their reconnection been part of a plan to gather evidence for some kind of legal action? The timing seemed suspicious, files being accessed just as he re-entered her life. But another possibility seemed equally likely, that James, having learned of Michael's reappearance and Alexandra's interest in the old safety reports, was trying to bury evidence before she could find it. Lock down the servers, she instructed. Full audit trail on everything accessed in the last month. And I want security footage of the server room for the same period. No one enters that room until I get there. You're coming in now? Alexandra looked at Sophie, chatting animatedly with Emily through the car windows. She'd promised her daughter a day without interruptions, without work emergencies taking precedence. No, she decided firmly. Secure everything, but this can wait until tomorrow. I'll be in first thing. She ended the call and returned to the cars, where Michael waited with unconcealed curiosity. Everything all right? He asked again. Alexandra studied his face, looking for signs of deception, of a hidden agenda. But all she saw was genuine concern, the same straightforward honesty that had first drawn her to him. Just a minor issue at the office, she lied smoothly. Nothing that can't wait. The words felt bitter in her mouth. She was doing exactly what James had accused Michael of doing, keeping secrets, hiding problems until they became catastrophic. But until she knew who to trust, caution seemed prudent. We'll follow you back to the penthouse, Michael offered, not pressing for details. Alexandra nodded, the weight of suspicion already creating distance between them. As she slid into the driver's seat, Sophie touched her arm. Is your work mad that you took a day off for me? She asked quietly. The question broke Alexandra's heart a little. No, sweetheart. And even if they were, it wouldn't matter. Today was important. Because of the butterflies? Alexandra smiled, pushing corporate intrigue aside to focus on her daughter. Because of you. Always because of you. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Alexandra entered Morgan Enterprises headquarters at precisely 7:00 a.m., 3 hours before the emergency board meeting she'd called. The building was quiet, only security and early rising executives populating its gleaming corridors. She bypassed her corner office and headed directly to the IT department, where the head of cybersecurity waited with barely concealed anxiety. Ms. Morgan, I've prepared a full report as requested. Show me, Alexandra instructed, following him into a small conference room where multiple monitors displayed security footage and access logs. The unauthorized access began approximately 4 weeks ago, he explained, bringing up a timeline. Small, targeted extractions of archived files, specifically focusing on safety reports from the headquarters construction project, personnel files from the engineering department that was downsized 3 years ago, and all documentation related to the accident in the executive garage. Alexandra's jaw tightened at the clinical reference to the event that had changed Sophie's life forever. And you're certain these access attempts came from James Whitfield's credentials? Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean Mr. Whitfield himself was accessing the files. Credentials can be stolen, spoofed. I understand how hacking works, Alexandra cut him off. What about the security footage? The cybersecurity head shifted uncomfortably. That's where things get interesting. The server room footage shows no unauthorized entry during the times the files were accessed. However, he brought up another video feed. There were multiple after-hours visits by Mr. Whitfield himself over the past month. Nothing unusual about that. As CFO, he has clearance, but his behavior was odd. The footage showed James entering the server room late at night, spending several minutes on a terminal, then leaving with nothing, no files, no devices. He wasn't removing physical documents, Alexandra observed. He was creating a digital backdoor, wasn't he? The cybersecurity head looked impressed. That's our assessment, yes, setting up remote access that wouldn't trigger our standard security protocols. And yesterday's sloppy extraction that triggered the alerts? That came from an external IP address, a public library downtown. Whoever did it knew enough to hide their identity, but not enough to maintain the careful extraction pattern. Alexandra leaned back considering. Or they wanted to be detected, to create exactly this situation where suspicion falls on James while leaving reasonable doubt. That's possible, the security head acknowledged, though quite sophisticated. Can you show me exactly which files were accessed yesterday? He pulled up a detailed log. Alexandra scanned the list, her blood running cold as she reached the final entries. Personnel file, Michael Reynolds. Medical records, Sophie Morgan. Accident report, executive garage incident. Someone was connecting the same dots she had been, linking Michael's safety warnings to Sophie's accident. But why access Sophie's medical records? And why now? I want all of this presented at the board meeting, Alexandra decided. And I want the building's original electrical schematics, along with all safety reports filed during and after construction. The complete paper trail. Those would be in facilities management, not our digital archives. Then get them from facilities. I want everything in the boardroom by 9:30. As the cybersecurity head hurried to comply, Alexandra checked her watch. 2 hours until the meeting that might well determine the future of Morgan Enterprises, and possibly her own future as its CEO. She needed to prepare to anticipate every counter-argument James might make. But first, she had a more important call to make. Dr. Weiss answered on the second ring. Alexandra, good morning. Is everything all right with Sophie? I hope so, Alexandra replied, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. Yesterday at the Botanical Gardens, I noticed something. Sophie's right foot moved. Just a small twitch, but definite movement. There was a pause on the line. Involuntary spasm? Possibly. It happened when a butterfly landed on her shoulder, almost like a reflex response to the sensation. But Sophie didn't report feeling anything. No, I asked casually if she could feel the butterfly, and she said no. Dr. Weiss hummed thoughtfully. It could be nothing. Autonomic nervous system responses can sometimes appear like voluntary movement. But it's worth investigating. Bring Sophie in this afternoon. I'll run some tests. Alexandra felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by caution. I don't want to create false expectations. Sophie's been through enough disappointment. We'll keep it casual, just a routine checkup as far as she's concerned. After ending the call, Alexandra made her way to her office, mind churning with possibilities. Could Sophie have more sensation than they'd realized? Had they missed something in the initial prognosis? And what would it mean for her daughter if there was even a small chance of improvement? She was so absorbed in these thoughts that she almost collided with James Whitfield in the corridor outside her office. Alexandra. His tone was all business, the friendly facade discarded. I was just coming to see you. The board meeting is at 10, she replied coolly, moving to step around him. That's what I wanted to discuss. James blocked her path subtly. I think you're making a serious mistake. Dredging up the past, creating potential liability issues. The board won't thank you for it. The board works for the shareholders, James, and the shareholders deserve to know if there's been negligence. The shareholders care about stock price and dividends, James countered, both of which will take a substantial hit if you start publicly suggesting the company was responsible for your daughter's accident. Alexandra felt a flare of anger. Is that a threat? It's reality. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, I understand you're upset about Sophie. We all are. But this crusade you're on, it won't help her. It won't change what happened. It will only damage the company you've built. The company I've built should be able to withstand the truth, Alexandra responded evenly. Unless there's something specifically you're worried might come to light. James's expression hardened. I'm worried about you, Alex. You're not thinking clearly. This electrician has gotten into your head, making you question decisions that were made years ago by professionals who understood the complexities involved. Professionals like you? Alexander held his gaze steadily. Who dismissed safety concerns as unfounded and fired the engineer who raised them? A muscle twitched in James's jaw. The board supported that decision unanimously, including you. Based on information you provided, Alexandra countered, information I'm now beginning to question. James shook his head, a hint of genuine regret crossing his features. I've always respected you, Alex, your vision, your leadership. But this is personal for you. and personal vendettas have no place in corporate governance. You're right about one thing, Alexandra agreed. This is personal. My daughter will never walk again because someone decided saving money was more important than following safety protocols. So yes, I take that personally. She stepped around him decisively. I'll see you in the boardroom, James. As she entered her office and closed the door, Alexandra felt a curious mixture of dread and determination. The confrontation that had been brewing for years, perhaps since the moment of Sophie's accident, was finally coming to a head, and she wasn't entirely sure she would emerge victorious. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Michael, good luck today. Sophie told me about the board meeting. You're doing the right thing. Alexandra stared at the message, conflicted. She hadn't told Sophie about the meeting or its purpose. How had her daughter known? Had Michael somehow found out through other channels? The cybersecurity breach flashed through her mind. Someone accessing files about Michael, about Sophie, about the accident. Before she could pursue that thought further, another message appeared. Emily and I made breakfast for Sophie before school. Hope that's okay. Your housekeeper let us in. The simple domesticity of the message, so at odds with corporate intrigue and suspicion, made Alexandra smile despite her concerns. Michael and Emily had become fixtures in their lives with surprising speed, filling empty spaces Alexandra hadn't even recognized existed. She texted back, "Thank you for everything." His response came quickly, "Just returning the favor. You've been good to Emily." Alexandra set down her phone, focusing on the task ahead. Whatever Michael's motivations, whether simple kindness or something more complicated, would have to wait. Right now, she had a board to confront and a truth to uncover. The Morgan Enterprises boardroom embodied corporate power, gleaming mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic city views. Alexandra had always felt at home here, commanding the space with the authority that had made her one of the youngest female CEOs in the country. Today, however, she felt a subtle shift in dynamics as soon as she entered. Board members clustered in small groups, conversations dying as she approached. James sat at the far end of the table, opposite her usual position, surrounded by his strongest allies on the board. A power play, subtle but unmistakable. "Good morning," Alexandra greeted them collectively, taking her seat with deliberate calm. "Thank you all for accommodating this emergency meeting." "Of course, Alexandra," Charles Donnelly, the board chair, responded with professional courtesy. "Though I must say, the mysterious agenda has caused considerable speculation." "I apologize for the ambiguity," Alexandra replied, "but I believe this matter required in-person discussion rather than email summaries." She nodded to her assistant, who distributed thick folders to each board member. "What you're receiving contains 3 sets of documents. First, safety reports filed by Michael Reynolds, then senior electrical engineer regarding potential hazards in the headquarters electrical systems. Second, records showing these reports were dismissed without proper investigation. And third, evidence suggesting these same electrical defects directly contributed to the accident in the executive garage, the accident that paralyzed my daughter." A murmur ran through the room as board members began flipping through the documents. James remained stonily silent, his expression unreadable. "Alexandra," Charles began carefully, "while we all sympathize with your daughter's situation, bringing a personal matter before the board is unusual." "This isn't just personal," Alexandra countered. "It's about corporate governance, about how safety concerns were handled, or mishandled, under our watch. It's about liability we may still carry, and most importantly, it's about ensuring nothing like this happens again." "These reports were thoroughly reviewed at the time," James interjected, his voice carrying practiced authority. "Multiple experts concluded the concerns were theoretical at best, not imminent safety issues." "By multiple experts, you mean the contractors who had financial incentives to minimize problems and keep the project on schedule?" Alexandra challenged, pulling a specific document from her folder. "This internal memo shows you specifically instructed them to find cost-effective alternatives to the rewiring Mr. Reynolds recommended." James's eyes narrowed slightly. "Cost management is literally my job, Alexandra, and alternative solutions aren't the same as ignoring problems." Except in this case, they were. Alexandra turned to the board. 3 months after these reports were buried and Mr. Reynolds was terminated, an electrical surge in the executive garage caused the elevator system to malfunction. My daughter was trapped inside when it fell 2 floors. She let the words hang in the air, the human cost suddenly visceral in the sterile corporate environment. Several board members looked genuinely disturbed, while others maintained careful neutrality. There's more, Alexandra continued, pressing her advantage. Yesterday, a security breach was detected in our server systems. Someone has been systematically accessing files related to these safety reports, to Mr. Reynolds' termination, and to Sophie's accident. She nodded to the cybersecurity head, who had been waiting outside. He entered and quickly set up a presentation showing the evidence they'd gathered that morning. The access originated from James Whitfield's credentials, Alexandra explained, as security footage played on the screen. While Mr. Whitfield claims his account was hacked, our investigation shows he personally created backdoor access to these specific files. James stood abruptly. This is outrageous. You're constructing a conspiracy theory to justify your personal vendetta against the company, against me, because you can't accept that your daughter's accident was just that, an accident. If it was just an accident, Alexandra replied evenly, why are you so interested in these old files now? Why access Sophie's medical records? Why pull Mr. Reynolds' personnel file 3 weeks ago, exactly when he came back into our lives? A tense silence fell over the room. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly trying to assess which executive to back in this unprecedented confrontation. I think, Charles finally said, we need to hear from Mr. Whitfield directly. James straightened, smoothing at his tie in a gesture Alexandra recognized as his preparation for difficult negotiations. Yes, I accessed those files not to hide evidence, but to protect this company. He turned to address the board directly. When Alexandra suddenly began spending time with a former employee who had been terminated for cause, a man with clear motivation to damage this company, I became concerned. I reviewed the old files to refresh my memory of the situation, to understand what kind of threat we might be facing. Threat? Alexandra repeated incredulously. Yes, threat. James's voice hardened. A disgruntled ex-employee who spent 3 years nursing a grudge, who suddenly befriends the CEO and her injured daughter. Who convinces Alexandra that somehow the company, that we, are responsible for a tragic accident? What would you call that except a threat? He gestured to the documents before them. These safety reports were reviewed by qualified experts who determined the issues weren't critical. That was a professional's judgment call, made in good faith. The fact that an accident later occurred in the same facility doesn't automatically mean the two are connected. Alexandra felt the momentum shifting, board members nodding along with James's reasonable-sounding explanation. She had underestimated him, again. There's one more thing the board should know, she said, playing her final card. Sophie's medical team is conducting new tests this afternoon. Yesterday, I observed movement in her right foot, something the doctors originally said would be impossible given her spinal injury. Confused looks passed between board members at this apparent non sequitur. What does that have to do with these allegations? Charles asked. Everything, Alexandra replied, because Sophie's original medical assessment may have been incomplete or inaccurate. And if that's the case, we need to question everything about how this accident was handled, including the settlement the company reached with me as Sophie's guardian. James paled slightly. You can't be suggesting. I'm suggesting, Alexandra cut him off, that we have a moral and legal obligation to thoroughly investigate what happened 3 years ago, not just for Sophie's sake, but for the integrity of this company. Charles looked troubled. Alexandra, while I understand your personal stake in this, reopening a legally settled matter could expose the company to significant liability. We're already exposed, Alexandra insisted. If it's proven the company ignored legitimate safety warnings that directly led to Sophie's injury, any settlement based on incomplete medical information could be invalidated. The boardroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Alexandra had effectively cornered them. Pursue the investigation she wanted, or risk even greater liability if the truth emerged through other channels. I propose, Charles finally said, that we adjourn to consider this matter privately. Alexandra, James, perhaps you could both give us the room. Alexandra nodded, gathering her materials. She had made her case as strongly as possible. Now it was up to the board to decide where their loyalties and their concerns about liability would lead them. As she and James exited to opposite sides of the room, he caught her eye with a look that mixed anger and something that might have been respect. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "No," Alexandra agreed. "It's just beginning." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Dr. Weiss's office, casting long shadows across the examination room. Sophie sat on the edge of the table in a hospital gown, her face a mixture of confusion and apprehension as electrodes were attached to her lower limbs. "Is something wrong?" she asked, looking between her mother and the doctor. "You said this was just a checkup." "Nothing's wrong," Alexandra assured her, keeping her voice calm despite the hope fluttering into your chest. "Dr. Weiss just wants to run some additional tests. We're always monitoring for changes," Dr. Weiss added smoothly, adjusting equipment with practiced hands. "Sometimes the body heals in ways we don't initially expect." Sophie's eyes widened. "You mean I might walk again?" The naked hope in her voice made Alexandra's heart constrict. "We don't know, sweetheart. We're just checking." "But something made you want to check, right?" Sophie pressed, too intelligent to be easily diverted. "Something changed?" Alexandra hesitated, then decided honesty was better than false protection. "I thought I saw your foot move yesterday at the gardens. Just a small twitch when the butterfly landed on your shoulder." Sophie looked down at her motionless feet with new intensity, as if willing them to reveal secrets. "I didn't feel anything." "That's what we're checking," Dr. Weiss explained. "Sometimes neural pathways can begin regenerating without immediately restoring sensation. Movement might return before feeling, or vice versa." The doctor proceeded with various tests: electrical stimulation of muscle groups, pressure points, temperature sensitivity. Sophie watched everything with the solemn concentration of a child who had grown accustomed to medical scrutiny, who had learned to treat her own body as something to be analyzed rather than experienced. Alexandra observed from a chair in the corner, her mind divided between the hope of positive results and the memory of the board meeting that morning. The board had ultimately decided to form an investigative committee, not the full inquiry she'd wanted, but not a dismissal either. A careful middle ground that neither vindicated her concerns nor completely rejected them. "Alexandra?" Dr. Weiss's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Could you join us, please?" She moved to the examination table where Sophie was now lying flat, electrodes still attached to her legs. Dr. Weiss adjusted a monitor so they could both see the readouts. "I'm going to stimulate the nerve pathway again," he explained. "Watch the screen closely." As a small electrical current was applied to Sophie's lower back, the monitor showed a faint but unmistakable response. Neurons firing, carrying signals down pathways that had supposedly been permanently damaged. "What does that mean?" Alexandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Weiss's expression was cautiously optimistic. "It means there may be intact neural pathways we didn't detect in our initial assessments. The spinal damage is still severe, but it might not be as complete as we thought." "So I could walk again?" Sophie asked, hope blazing in her eyes. "I don't want to overstate the possibilities," Dr. Weiss cautioned. "We're talking about very minimal responses, but it does suggest we should reassess your condition and perhaps consider some experimental treatments that weren't options before." Alexandra felt dizzy with competing emotions. Hope, fear, vindication, uncertainty. If Sophie's condition had been misdiagnosed, even partially, it changed everything, not just for her daughter's future, but for the investigation into what had caused the accident in the first place. "What's our next step?" she asked, working to keep her voice steady for Sophie's sake. "I want to schedule an advanced MRI with neural tracking," Dr. Weiss replied, "and I'd like to consult with specialists in regenerative medicine. There have been significant advances in the past 3 years." As they discussed logistics, Alexandra's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it, focusing on the conversation, but it buzzed again repeatedly, the pattern she'd set for urgent messages. Excusing herself briefly, she stepped into the hallway to check. Multiple missed calls from the office, a text from her assistant. "Emergency, James called surprise shareholder meeting, vote of no confidence in progress." Alexandra stared at the message in disbelief. James was moving faster than she'd anticipated, using her absence for Sophie's appointment to stage a corporate coup. She had perhaps an hour at most to get back to headquarters and defend her position. But Sophie was still on the examination table, still processing the possibility of a medical breakthrough, still needing her mother's presence and support. Alexandra closed her eyes briefly, the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. CEO or mother, corporate warrior or protective parent. The division that had defined her life since Sophie's birth, made infinitely more acute by the accident. When she re-entered the examination room, Sophie looked up with shining eyes. Dr. Weiss says I might be able to join a new clinical trial. Isn't that amazing? Alexandra forced a smile, her decision made. That's wonderful news, sweetheart. We'll need to run more tests, Dr. Weiss cautioned, and managing expectations is important. This isn't a guaranteed recovery, just a new avenue to explore. I understand, Alexandra assured him, taking Sophie's hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. As Dr. Weiss stepped out to arrange the additional scans, Sophie squeezed her mother's hand. Mom, are you okay? You look worried. Alexandra smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead. I'm fine. Just processing all this new information. Is it about work? Your phone kept buzzing. Work can wait, Alexandra said firmly. This is more important. Sophie studied her mother's face with that uncanny perception children sometimes possess. Is it about the investigation? About what happened to me? Alexandra hesitated, surprised by her daughter's awareness. What do you know about that? Michael told me, Sophie admitted. Not everything, but enough. He said you're trying to find out if the accident could have been prevented. Alexandra felt a flash of anger that Michael had discussed this with Sophie without consulting her, followed immediately by guilt at her own habit of shielding Sophie from difficult truths. Yes, she acknowledged, that's part of what I'm doing. Is that why you're in trouble at work? Because you're asking questions about my accident? Alexandra sat on the edge of the examination table, considering how much to share. Some people at my company think I'm letting personal feelings affect my business judgment. Because of me, Sophie concluded, her voice small. No, sweetheart, not because of you. Alexandra took both her daughter's hands, because sometimes people are more concerned with protecting themselves than doing what's right. And yes, right now there's a meeting happening that I should probably be at, but I'm here instead because you matter more. Sophie's brow furrowed in thought. But if you lose your job because you're here with me, then I lose my job, Alexandra finished simply, and we figure out what comes next. Together. The enormity of this statement, from a woman who had built her identity around corporate success, hung in the air between them. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to be a burden, she whispered. You are not a burden, Alexandra said fiercely. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. And any success that comes at the expense of being your mother isn't success at all. As they embraced, Alexandra's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a number she didn't recognize. It's Michael. Something's happening at Morgan HQ. Board members arriving for unscheduled meeting. James looking smug. Should I be concerned? Alexandra stared at the message in confusion. How did Michael know what was happening at headquarters? Why was he there in the first place? Before she could respond, another message came through. I was installing new fixtures in boardroom. Overheard James. He's telling people you've become unstable, obsessed with conspiracy theories, claiming you're using company resources for personal vendettas. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. James hadn't hacked into the company servers. Michael had. Using his knowledge of the building's systems, perhaps maintenance access, he'd been gathering evidence about his own firing, about safety reports that had been buried, about the accident that had paralyzed Sophie. That's how he'd known to approach Sophie at the wedding. That's why he'd been so willing to help Alexandra reconnect with her daughter. It wasn't coincidence or kindness. It was calculated, a way to gain access and information for whatever he was planning. The realization hit Alexandra like physical pain. She'd allowed Michael into their lives, trusted him with Sophie, believed in his genuine concern. And all along, he'd been using them for his own agenda. Revenge, litigation, or something else she couldn't yet see. Dr. Weiss returned with a technician ready to take Sophie for the advanced scans. This will take about an hour, he explained. You're welcome to accompany her or wait here if you prefer. Alexandra looked at her daughter, at the hope newly kindled in her eyes, at the possible future that might now be within reach. Then she looked at her phone, at the corporate crisis unfolding in her absence, at the betrayal by someone she'd begun to trust. I'll come with you, she told Sophie, putting her phone away. Whatever Michael's true motives, whatever James's power play, they could wait. For once in her life, Alexandra would be exactly where she needed to be, without division or distraction. As they wheeled Sophie toward the imaging department, Alexandra sent one brief text to Michael. Stay away from my daughter, from both of us. Then she turned off her phone and took her daughter's hand, stepping into an uncertain future that, for the first time in years, they would navigate together. The penthouse felt eerily quiet as Alexandra helped Sophie settle onto the living room sofa. The advanced neural scans had taken longer than expected, the doctor's cautious optimism tempered with clinical restraint. Promising indicators, they'd called the faint signals detected along Sophie's damaged spinal pathways. Not a miracle, not a guarantee, but something that hadn't existed before. Possibility. Can I have some hot chocolate? Sophie asked, her voice small with exhaustion. The medical test had drained her, physically and emotionally. Of course, sweetheart. Alexandra moved to the kitchen, grateful for a simple request she could fulfill. As the milk warmed on the stove, she checked her phone for the first time in hours. 27 missed calls, 43 text messages. The digital aftermath of corporate warfare. A text from her executive assistant topped the list. Emergency board vote postponed. James couldn't secure enough support without warning. Rescheduled for tomorrow morning. Urgent. Call when you can. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by the realization that she'd only been granted a temporary reprieve. James had failed to ambush her today, but tomorrow she would face the full force of his challenge, prepared and orchestrated. She scrolled through the remaining messages, board members expressing concern, executive team members requesting guidance, legal counsel suggesting preparatory meetings, and buried among them, 5 increasingly desperate messages from Michael. What's wrong? What happened? Please tell me what's going on. Is Sophie okay? Are you? Alexandra, I don't understand. Talk to me. Whatever you think I've done, at least let me explain. The last message had come just 30 minutes ago. Alexandra stared at it, conflict churning inside her. Had she jumped to conclusions? Misinterpreted the situation? Or had she finally seen through a carefully constructed facade? Mom, is the hot chocolate ready? Sophie called from the living room. Coming, Alexandra replied, pushing thoughts of Michael aside as she poured the steaming liquid into Sophie's favorite mug, a ceramic creation painted with butterflies that Emily had given her just last week. Emily, another innocent caught in whatever game the adults were playing. Alexandra felt a pang of regret for the friendship that would become collateral damage in this unfolding drama. As she handed Sophie the hot chocolate, her phone rang. The building security desk. Ms. Morgan, there's a Michael Reynolds here asking to see you. He says it's urgent. Should I send him up? Alexandra's pulse quickened. No, tell him I'm not available. She ended the call before the security guard could respond, then immediately regretted the abruptness of her reaction. What if Sophie asked who had called? What should she tell her daughter about Michael's sudden banishment from their lives? Was that Michael? Sophie asked, confirming Alexandra's fears about her daughter's perceptiveness. Yes, Alexandra admitted, sitting beside Sophie on the sofa. He wanted to come up, but I said no. Sophie's brow furrowed. Why? I thought you liked him. It's complicated, sweetheart. Alexandra chose her words carefully. I've learned some things that make me question his intentions. What things? How to explain corporate espionage and potential legal manipulation to a 10-year-old. Alexandra sighed. I believe Michael may have been using our friendship to gather information about the company, about the accident. He might be planning to use that information against us. Sophie's face registered confusion, then hurt. You mean he was just pretending to like us? To be our friend? I don't know for certain, Alexandra admitted, but there are signs that suggest he hasn't been completely honest about why he came into our lives. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this betrayal with the same solemn intensity she brought to everything since the accident. What about Emily? Was she pretending too? The question broke Alexandra's heart. No, I don't think Emily was pretending anything. I think her friendship with you is very real. But I won't get to see her anymore, will I? Sophie's voice trembled slightly. Because you and Michael are fighting. Alexandra wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. I don't know what happens next, but I promise you, I'll try to find a way for you and Emily to stay friends, no matter what. Sophie nodded against her mother's shoulder, but the slump in her posture spoke volumes about her belief in such promises. Too many adults had made and broken commitments to her since the accident. Doctors who promised treatments that failed. Therapists who moved on to other patients. Her own mother, who had repeatedly chosen work over presence. I'm tired, Sophie said finally. Can I go to bed? Of course. Alexandra helped her daughter transfer to the wheelchair. The practice movement, a reminder of all the ways their lives had been permanently altered. Do you want me to read to you tonight? Sophie shook her head. Not tonight. As Alexandra tucked her daughter into bed, she noticed the paper cranes on the bedside table. Origami creations Michael had shown Sophie how to fold on one of their Saturday gatherings, little paper wishes waiting to take flight. She reached out to touch one, its fragile form a metaphor for the delicate connections they'd been building. Mom? Sophie's voice was already heavy with approaching sleep. If my legs get better, will everything else get better too? Alexandra smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead. I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so. She stayed until Sophie's breathing deepened into sleep, then returned to the living room where the demands of the corporate world awaited. Tomorrow morning, she would face the board, defend her leadership, and potentially lose everything she'd spent decades building. The prospect should have terrified her, but somehow after the day's medical revelations, corporate politics seemed strangely trivial. Her phone buzzed with a text notification. Michael again. I'm still in the lobby. Please. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Alexandra moved to the window, looking down at the building entrance far below. Even from this height, she could make out Michael's figure pacing near the entrance, stopping occasionally to look up at the penthouse windows. His persistence spoke either of genuine concern or calculated determination, and she no longer trusted herself to know which. Against her better judgment, she texted back, "The security desk will let you up. 5 minutes. That's it." She watched as he disappeared into the building, then steeled herself for the confrontation to come. Whatever his true motives, she would face them directly, as she'd faced every other challenge in her life. The private elevator announced his arrival with a soft chime. When the doors opened, Michael stepped out cautiously, as if entering hostile territory. His work clothes were rumpled, his face lined with worry, his ever-present tool bag absent for the first time since she'd known him. Thank you for seeing me, he began, remaining near the elevator. Alexandra stood on the opposite side of the room, arms crossed. You have 5 minutes to explain why you've been accessing Morgan Enterprises' secure servers and pulling files about Sophie's accident. Michael's face registered genuine shock. What? I haven't been accessing any servers. Don't lie to me. Alexandra's voice was ice. You texted me about the emergency board meeting. You knew James was making a move against me. How could you have known that unless you were monitoring our internal communications? Because I was there, Michael explained, stepping forward. I told you I was installing new fixtures in the boardroom. I overheard James on the phone planning the whole thing. I wasn't spying, Alexandra. I was working. Working? Alexandra's eyebrow raised skeptically. You just happened to be working at Morgan headquarters? The company that fired you 3 years ago? The company whose safety failures paralyzed my daughter? Michael's face flushed. I was subcontracted through Capital Electric. The building management wouldn't know my history with Morgan. It was coincidence, not conspiracy. Coincidence. Alexandra's laugh was bitter. Like it was coincidence that you approached Sophie at the wedding? That you inserted yourself into our lives just as I was beginning to question the official story about her accident? Yes, Michael's voice rose in frustration. That's exactly what it was. I saw a lonely child and reached out to her. Because that's what decent people do. Because my own daughter needed friends. Because, he stopped abruptly, running a hand through his hair. This is insane. What exactly are you accusing me of? Alexandra moved closer, anger fueling her courage. Someone has been systematically accessing files about Sophie's accident, about your termination, about the safety reports you filed. They've been building a case against Morgan Enterprises, a case that could be worth millions in a lawsuit. Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes. And you think that someone is me. It wasn't a question, but a realization. The evidence points that way. What evidence? Michael challenged. Show me one piece of actual evidence that I've done anything wrong. Alexandra faltered. The server access had come from James's credentials, not anything linking to Michael. The information about the emergency board meeting could have been overheard exactly as he claimed. His explanation was entirely plausible. And yet, if not you, then who? She demanded. Who else would have motive to dig into these old files right when you reappeared in our lives? James Whitfield, Michael answered immediately, the man responsible for burying my safety reports, the man who fired me to protect himself, the man who now sees you questioning the official narrative about the accident and recognizes the threat to his position. His logic mirrored her own earlier suspicions before doubt had clouded her judgment. Alexandra's certainty wavered. Why should I believe you? She asked, her voice less accusatory now. Because I have never lied to you, Michael replied simply. Not once. Not about who I am, not about what happened 3 years ago, not about why I care about Sophie. He took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the earnestness in his eyes. I approached your daughter at that wedding because she reminded me of Emily after her mother left. Isolated, wounded, brave beyond what any child should have to be. That's it. No agenda, no conspiracy. The raw honesty in his voice made Alexandra want to believe him. But years of corporate navigation had taught her to question a parent's sincerity, to look for the calculation behind compassion. Then explain the text messages, she pressed. How did you know there was trouble at headquarters today? How did you know about the safety reports being buried if you weren't accessing our systems? Michael sighed, moving to the sofa and sitting heavily, as if the weight of suspicion had become physically burdensome. May I? He asked, gesturing to the seat he'd taken. Alexandra nodded stiffly, taking the chair opposite him. I didn't know about the board meeting until I heard James on the phone, Michael began. I was there replacing outdated light fixtures. A 2-day job I started yesterday. As for the safety reports, he hesitated. I knew they were buried because I kept copies. Every report I filed, every email that was ignored, every response dismissing legitimate concerns, I documented all of it. Why? Alexandra asked, genuinely curious. Because I knew someday the truth would matter. Michael's gaze was steady, not for a lawsuit or revenge, but because faulty wiring doesn't fix itself. Because the next time there was an electrical failure, I wanted evidence that it could have been prevented. And then Sophie's accident happened, Alexandra said quietly. Michael nodded, pain crossing his features. When I heard about it, just another corporate news item at the time, I thought about coming forward. But what good would it have done? The damage was already done. No one was listening before. Why would they listen after? The simple logic resonated with Alexandra. How many whistleblowers had she seen sidelined in her industry, their careers destroyed for speaking uncomfortable truths? How many warnings had she herself glossed over in pursuit of efficiency and profit? If you have copies of everything, she said slowly, why haven't you used them? Against the company? Against James? Michael's laugh held no humor. And accomplish what exactly? Get labeled a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind? Spend money I don't have fighting corporate lawyers who get paid whether they win or lose? Put Emily through the stress of watching her father take on a fight he couldn't win? He leaned forward, his expression intense. The question isn't why I haven't used the documents. The question is why someone at Morgan Enterprises is suddenly interested in them again after 3 years. The implication hung between them, that James might be accessing the files not to build a case against the company, but to destroy evidence before it could be discovered, to protect himself from the consequences of decisions made years ago. Your 5 minutes are up, Alexandra said finally, but there was no force behind the words. Michael stood, understanding the dismissal. There's one more thing you should know, he said as he moved toward the elevator. James came to see me 6 months ago, offered me a settlement, a significant amount of money in exchange for my silence and any documentation I had about the safety issues. Alexandra's eyes widened. What did you tell him? I told him to get off my property. Michael's voice held quiet dignity. Some things aren't for sale. The truth about what happened to your daughter is one of them. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Alexandra remained motionless, her certainties once again upended. If Michael was telling the truth, if James had tried to buy his silence months ago, then everything took on a different complexion. The server access, the emergency board meeting, the attempt to discredit her, all might be James's desperate moves to prevent the truth from emerging. But that still didn't explain how Michael had ended up at the wedding, how he'd recognized Sophie, how this improbable connection had formed at precisely the moment when questions about the accident were resurfacing. Unless, unless he was telling the simple truth, that he had seen a lonely child and reached out with the instinctive kindness that defined his relationship with his own daughter, that the timing was indeed coincidence, not calculation. Alexandra moved to the window, looking down at the street as Michael emerged from the building and walked to his truck. His shoulders were slumped, his stride lacking the confidence she'd come to associate with him. He looked defeated in a way that felt genuine, not performed. Her phone rang, her executive assistant again. This time she answered. Alexandra, legal needs to speak with you immediately about tomorrow's board meeting. They've prepared a defense strategy, but they need your input on several key points. Tell them I'll call in 30 minutes, Alexandra replied, her mind racing with a new possibility. And find out everything you can about any settlement offers made to Michael Reynolds in the past year. Unofficial approaches, off-the-books negotiations, anything that wouldn't have gone through normal channels. As she ended the call, Alexandra made another decision. She unlocked her personal safe and removed a small external hard drive, her own private backup of critical company information, maintained as insurance against exactly the kind of corporate coup James was attempting. If Michael had kept documentation of his safety warnings, and if James had tried to buy his silence, there might be a corresponding trail within Morgan Enterprises. Authorizations for unofficial payouts, legal consultations about potential liability, perhaps even discussions about the true cause of the garage electrical failure. Alexandra connected the drive to her laptop and began searching, her corporate training temporarily set aside in favor of something more primal, a mother's determination to uncover the truth about what had happened to her child. Dawn broke over the city, painting the skyscrapers in shades of gold and pink. Alexandra stood at her penthouse window, watching the early morning light transform the urban landscape. She hadn't slept. Hours of research, phone calls with trusted allies, and careful planning had filled the night instead. Behind her, the dining table was covered with documents, printouts from her private backup, medical reports from Dr. Weiss, copies of the original accident investigation, and transcripts of key meetings from the period before and after Sophie's injury. The evidence told a story far different from the official narrative she'd accepted 3 years ago. Her phone chimed with a calendar alert. Board meeting, 8 o'clock a.m. The confrontation she couldn't avoid was now just 2 hours away. Alexandra moved quietly through the penthouse to Sophie's room, easing the door open to check on her sleeping daughter. Sophie lay peaceful amid her pillows, her face relaxed in sleep in a way it rarely was while awake. On her bedside table, the paper cranes stood sentinel, fragile symbols of hope that had survived Alexandra's moment of doubt. She closed the door gently and returned to the living room, gathering the documents into her briefcase. Whatever happened at the board meeting, she was now armed with something more powerful than corporate maneuvering: truth. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Michael, whatever happens today, know that I'm on your side. Always have been. Alexandra stared at the message, the simple assertion of loyalty touching something deep within her. After a moment's hesitation, she replied, I believe you, and I'm sorry I doubted. His response came immediately. Nothing to be sorry for. You were protecting Sophie, as you should. The exchange, brief as it was, steadied her. For 3 years, she had navigated the aftermath of Sophie's accident alone, building walls between herself and the pain, between herself and her daughter, between herself and any genuine connection. Michael had somehow breached those walls, not through force, but through simple humanity, the same quality that had drawn him to Sophie at the wedding. Alexandra finished dressing for battle, her most impeccable suit, her most commanding heels, her armor against the corporate world. But as she prepared to leave, she made a detour to Sophie's room once more, sitting gently on the edge of the bed until her daughter stirred. "Mom?" Sophie blinked sleepily. "It's early." "I know, sweetheart. I have an important meeting this morning." Alexandra stroked her daughter's hair. "But I wanted to tell you something before I go." Sophie pushed herself up against the pillows, instantly alert to the seriousness in her mother's voice. "I made a mistake about Michael," Alexandra admitted. "He wasn't using us or lying to us. He was just being kind, and I've been surrounded by people with agendas for so long that I forgot kindness can be simple." Sophie's face brightened. "So we can see him and Emily again?" "Yes," Alexandra promised. "As soon as this meeting is over, I'll call him myself." "Is your meeting about the accident? About what really happened to me?" Alexandra nodded, impressed again by her daughter's perception. "Yes, and it might be difficult. I might not be the company's CEO after today." She had expected Sophie to look worried at this admission. Instead, her daughter's expression was thoughtful. "Would that be so bad?" Sophie asked. "You don't seem very happy there anymore." The simple observation cut through years of assumption and ambition. When had Alexandra last felt genuine satisfaction in her work? When had corporate success last brought her joy rather than just the next target to achieve? "Maybe it wouldn't be so bad," she acknowledged. "But either way, some things won't change. My love for you, our home, the things that really matter." Sophie reached for her mother's hand. "I know. I've always known that." Alexandra felt tears threatening, unexpected emotion on this day of all days, and blinked them back. "I should go, but I'll tell you everything when I get home. I promise." "Even the bad parts?" Sophie asked, her gaze direct. "Especially the bad parts," Alexandra assured her. "No more protecting you from truths you deserve to know." As she stood to leave, Sophie called after her. "Mom, be brave today, like you always tell me to be." Alexandra paused in the doorway, struck by the role reversal, her daughter offering courage for the challenge ahead. "I will," she promised, the words feeling like a vow. Caterer. Morgan Enterprises' headquarters gleamed in the morning sun, its glass and steel facade projecting the same confident prosperity it had when Alexandra had first joined the company as a junior executive 15 years ago. She entered through the main lobby, noticing how employees straightened as she passed, their expressions a mixture of deference and curiosity. News of the power struggle had clearly permeated all levels of the organization. As she rode the executive elevator to the top floor, Alexandra mentally rehearsed her approach. Not defense, but offense. Not explanation, but exposure. James had underestimated her, assuming that maternal concern would make her weak when in fact it had made her more formidable than ever before. The boardroom doors stood open, revealing most members already seated. James occupied a chair near the head of the table, her chair, a symbolic usurpation that might have angered her once, but now struck her as merely predictable. "Alexandra," Charles Donnelly greeted her with careful neutrality. "We were just about to begin." "Perfect timing, then." She moved to the head of the table, forcing James to either yield the position or make his challenge explicit from the outset. After a moment's hesitation, he slid one seat to the right, a minor concession that nonetheless established the tone of the confrontation to come. "Before we address the agenda," Alexandra began without preamble, "I'd like to present new information relevant to yesterday's discussion about the executive garage accident and subsequent investigations." She opened her briefcase, distributing folders to each board member. "What you're receiving contains 3 sets of documents. First, evidence that James Whitfield personally intercepted safety warnings about the electrical systems and buried them without proper review. Second, internal communications showing he deliberately misrepresented the findings to this board when recommending Michael Reynolds' termination. And third, records of an unofficial settlement offer made to Mr. Reynolds 6 months ago, authorized by Mr. Whitfield without board approval or proper documentation." A murmur ran through the room as board members began examining the materials. James's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd," he protested. "These documents are clearly fabricated. They're from my private backup of all executive-level communications." Alexandra cut him off. "The same backup you tried to access yesterday through the server breach. The same backup that, as CEO, I've maintained as protection against exactly this kind of corporate malfeasance. Charles Donnelly looked up from the documents, his expression grave. James, is this true? Did you authorize a private settlement offer to Mr. Reynolds? James's hesitation was answer enough, but he quickly recovered. I approached Reynolds informally to assess potential liability. It was a prudent risk management strategy, not an admission of wrongdoing. A strategy you implemented without board knowledge or approval, Alexandra pointed out, because you knew the truth would reveal your direct responsibility for the safety failures that led to my daughter's injury. That's a leap in logic, James began, but Alexandra wasn't finished. There's more, she continued, her voice steady. Yesterday, Sophie underwent new medical tests that revealed her spinal damage may not be as complete as initially diagnosed. There may be intact neural pathways the original assessment missed. She let the implications sink in. This means the medical foundation for our insurance settlement, for our public statements about the accident, for our entire approach to liability, may have been flawed from the beginning. The boardroom fell silent as directors processed this new information. Alexandra could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing corporate loyalty against personal liability, measuring the potential cost of continued cover-up against the price of transparency. What exactly are you proposing, Alexandra? Charles finally asked. Full disclosure, she answered without hesitation. A complete, independent investigation into the safety issues that were raised before the accident, into how those warnings were handled, and into the decisions made afterward. Transparency with insurers about Sophie's updated medical status, and accountability for those whose actions or inactions contributed to what happened. You're talking about potentially massive liability, one director objected. The shareholders deserve to know what kind of company they've invested in, Alexandra interrupted. One that values safety and accountability, or one that buries problems until they become catastrophes. James leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used for his most devastating arguments. While I sympathize with Alexandra's personal situation, we must consider the broader implications. This crusade she's on, reopening settled matters, casting aspersions on company leadership, demanding accountability for decisions made years ago. It's clearly being driven by emotion rather than sound business judgment. He looked around the table, making eye contact with key allies. I move that we proceed with the vote of no confidence, as scheduled. The evidence is clear. Alexandra Morgan is no longer capable of separating her personal grievances from her professional responsibilities. Several directors nodded in agreement, and Alexandra felt the momentum shifting against her. But she had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it through the sleepless night. Before you vote, she said calmly, you should know one more thing. I've already sent copies of all these documents to the State Attorney General's office, along with a formal request for investigation into potential criminal negligence. Shock rippled through the room. James half rose from his chair. You did what? I did what I should have done 3 years ago, Alexandra replied evenly. I chose truth over convenience, justice over expediency, the right thing over the profitable thing. She closed her briefcase with a decisive click. So yes, by all means, take your vote. Remove me as CEO if you wish, but understand that doing so won't stop what's already in motion. The truth is coming to light, with or without your cooperation. Charles Donnelly cleared his throat, clearly reassessing the situation. Perhaps we should table the vote until we've had time to review these materials more thoroughly. I agree, another director quickly added. We need legal counsel to advise us on next steps. Alexandra watched as the carefully orchestrated coup began to unravel, directors distancing themselves from James as they recognized the potential legal exposure. Self-interest was proving a more powerful motivator than loyalty, just as she'd counted on. By all means, review the materials, she agreed graciously. In the meantime, I'll be taking a leave of absence to focus on Sophie's medical care. Effective immediately. The announcement caught everyone by surprise, including she realized herself. The decision had crystallized only as she spoke the words, but it felt undeniably right. A leave of absence? Charles repeated. For how long? Indefinitely, Alexandra replied. My daughter needs me right now more than this company does. And after what I've learned about how Morgan Enterprises handled safety concerns that directly impacted her life, I need time to consider whether this is an organization I want to continue leading. She stood gathering her belongings with unhurried confidence. I'll expect the board's decision about the independent investigation by the end of the week. Choose wisely, ladies and gentlemen. Your response will determine not just the company's liability, but its integrity. As Alexandra walked toward the door, James made one final attempt to regain control. This is emotional blackmail, he accused. So you can't just walk away and leave the company in limbo while you... Watch me, Alexandra interrupted, her voice steel. And James, clean out your office. Regardless of what the board decides about my position, yours is terminated, effective immediately. She turned to Charles. As CEO, I still have that authority, unless the board overrides me right now. Charles looked around the table, reading the room with the political acumen that had made him an effective chairman. No one spoke in James's defense. No one challenged Alexandra's decision. I believe the board will support your judgment in this matter, Charles said carefully. Alexandra nodded, satisfied. I thought they might. As she left the boardroom, she felt lighter than she had in years, unburdened not just of corporate politics, but of the compromise and accommodation that had gradually eroded her own sense of right and wrong. She had chosen Sophie, unequivocally and without reservation. Whatever came next, that choice would define her path forward. The spring afternoon was perfect. Warm sunshine, gentle breeze, trees in full bloom, as Alexandra pushed Sophie's wheelchair along the park path. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the boardroom. 3 weeks of medical appointments and physical therapy sessions, of board negotiations conducted through attorneys, of gradually reconstructing what life might look like beyond the shadow of corporate ambition. There they are. Sophie pointed ahead to where Michael and Emily waited by the duck pond, a picnic blanket spread beneath a sprawling oak tree. Alexandra felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. She hadn't seen Michael since that night in her penthouse when suspicion had nearly destroyed the connection between them. They'd spoken by phone, exchanged text messages, coordinated today's meeting, but face-to-face reconciliation carried its own particular weight. Emily spotted them first, jumping up and running towards Sophie with unrestrained enthusiasm. You're here. Dad brought the special bread for the ducks, the kind that doesn't make them sick. And I made lemonade all by myself. Ma, Sophie grinned at her friend's excitement. Did you put in too much sugar again? Only a little too much, Emily admitted with a giggle. Dad says it might dissolve your teeth, but it tastes amazing. Michael approached more slowly, his expression careful, uncertain. Alexandra, it's good to see you. You too. She meant it, she realized. Despite everything, the confusion, the accusations, the near rupture of trust, she was genuinely glad to see him. He knelt beside Sophie's wheelchair. How are those new exercises going? The ones Dr. Weiss prescribed? They're hard, Sophie admitted, but Mom helps me every day. And sometimes I think I can feel something, not movement exactly, but like awareness in my legs. Michael nodded seriously. That's how healing works sometimes. Little signals getting stronger, making new pathways. Like electricity, finding a new circuit? Sophie asked, clearly familiar with Michael's preferred metaphors. Exactly like that. He smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. Smart kid. The easy rapport between them, undiminished by the weeks apart, touched Alexandra deeply. Whatever doubts she'd harbored about Michael's motives had never extended to the genuine connection he'd formed with her daughter. As the girls moved toward the pond to feed the ducks, Alexandra and Michael settled on the picnic blanket, a comfortable distance between them. How are you holding up? He asked. Really? Alexandra considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Better than I expected. Leaving Morgan was liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. And the investigation? Proceeding slowly. The board opted for internal review rather than independent investigation. Predictable, but disappointing. The Attorney General's office is still determining whether to pursue criminal charges against James. Michael nodded, unsurprised. Corporations protect their own. Always have. Not always, Alexandra corrected. Sometimes people within those corporations choose differently, make better choices. She held his gaze, the unspoken acknowledgement of his own choice 3 years ago, to stand by safety concerns despite the professional cost, hanging between them. Any regrets? Michael asked. About walking away from everything you built? Alexandra watched Sophie laughing with Emily at the edge of the pond, more animated and joyful than she'd been in years. None, she answered truthfully. I didn't walk away from everything that matters. They lapsed into comfortable silence, observing their daughter's easy friendship. Alexandra found herself studying Michael's profile, the strong jawline, the laugh lines around his eyes, the quiet confidence of a man who had built his life around work that mattered and a child who needed him. I've been thinking, she began tentatively, about what comes next. And Sophie's doctors believe the experimental treatment could help her regain some function. Not full recovery, but improvement. The protocol is being administered at a rehabilitation center in California. Michael nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. You're moving to California. For 6 months at least, while Sophie undergoes the treatment. Alexandra paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. I wondered if, that is, Emily has become so important to Sophie's happiness, and are you inviting us to visit, Michael asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm suggesting something more complicated, Alexandra admitted. The rehabilitation center needs a facilities manager, someone with experience in electrical systems, in accessibility modifications, someone who understands the unique needs of patients like Sophie. Michael's expression shifted from surprise to careful consideration. You're offering me a job. I'm suggesting a possibility, Alexandra clarified. One that would allow our daughters to maintain their friendship through a challenging transition. One that would allow you to use your skills in a meaningful context. One that would give us time to figure out whatever this is between us. She gestured vaguely between them, acknowledging the undefined connection that had developed despite all obstacles. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze following Emily as she helped Sophie toss bread to the eager ducks. I'd need to find a place to live. Schools for Emily, it's a big change. The center provides housing for staff, Alexandra explained. Good schools nearby. But I understand if it's too much to ask, if uprooting your life here isn't practical. Michael turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Ask me. What? Ask me directly, not as a suggestion or a possibility or hypothetical. Ask me what you really want to ask. Alexandra felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed in a way boardroom confrontations had never made her feel. Michael Reynolds, she said finally, her voice soft but steady, would you consider moving to California with your daughter so that our children can face this next chapter together? So that we can face it together? His smile was slow, genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. Yes, he said simply, I would consider that very seriously. Before Alexandra could respond, a commotion from the pond drew their attention. Sophie was half standing beside her wheelchair, Emily supporting her on one side, both girls calling excitedly. Mom, Michael, look! Sophie's voice trembled with exhilaration. I'm standing. I'm actually standing. Alexandra and Michael rushed to the pond's edge where Sophie was indeed upright, leaning heavily on Emily, but bearing some weight on her legs for the first time in 3 years. The duck, Sophie explained breathlessly. It was going to eat a plastic wrapper. I wanted to stop it, and I just stood up. Dr. Weiss had warned them that progress would be unpredictable. Small victories followed by plateaus, moments of breakthrough amid long stretches of hard work. But seeing Sophie standing, her face alight with accomplishment and wonder, was beyond anything Alexandra had dared to hope for so soon. Michael knelt beside the girls, offering additional support without taking over. That's amazing, Sophie. How does it feel? Wobbly, Sophie admitted with a laugh, and kind of scary, but good scary, you know. Alexandra watched the scene through tears she didn't bother to hide, her daughter standing between Michael and Emily, the three of them forming a tableau of support and possibility that she could never have imagined 3 months ago. I knew you could do it, Emily was saying, her face solemn with responsibility as she helped Sophie maintain balance. Dad says the hardest part of fixing anything is believing it can be fixed. Wise man, your dad, Alexandra commented, joining the group and adding her own support to Sophie's other side. Michael's eyes met hers over the girls' heads, And in that moment of perfect understanding, Alexandra knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, Sophie's recovery, the move to California, the redefinition of her own identity beyond corporate success, they would face them together, not as CEO and electrician, not as people from different worlds, but as partners who had found each other across the vast divides of circumstance and chance. "Think you can take a step?" Michael asked Sophie gently. Sophie's face set with determination, the same expression Alexandra had seen in board meetings, in physical therapy sessions, in quiet moments of courage throughout her daughter's young life. "I can try," Sophie answered, and as she shifted her weight, tentatively moving one foot forward, Alexandra felt the future shifting with her. Uncertain, challenging, but filled with a hope that had seemed impossible just months before. One step, small, unsteady, but undeniably real. Like their journey together, beginning with a simple question at a wedding reception. Why is she alone? She wasn't alone anymore. None of them were.